Humphrey was a hippo. He had been rescued at a young age after getting into difficulties when his river flooded. As a baby, he was taken in by wildlife lovers who cared for him for a short while. But with Africa's most dangerous animal comes a great deal of responsibility, and they could no longer care for him. That's when 40-year-old Marius Els decided to take him in. At that point, Humphrey was 5 months old and was growing fast. Marius was an army major turned farmer who was experienced at keeping some of Africa's wild animals. In the past, he had cared for a giraffe and a rhino, but nothing could prepare him for Humphrey. He allowed the hippo to roam his 400-acre farm, which sat on the banks of the Vaal River in Free State, South Africa. Free State is hot and arid, situated in mid to southeastern South Africa. It is characterized by grassy plains and comprises predominantly of pasture land for the agricultural communities. The Vaal River provides irrigation for the surrounding countryside and farmland. Part of this river ran through Marius's farm. Redirecting some of this water, he built a dam for Humphrey to swim in. In the wild, hippos remain with their mothers for up to 6 or 7 years, which is when they reach sexual maturity. They will suckle from their mothers for up to 8 months and won't become fully independent until they are sexually mature. As he grew up, Humphrey the hippo was learning all the time from Marius. He may have looked up to him, seeing him as a member of his family. Marius certainly felt like the hippo was part of his family in the same way a cat or dog is. Marius spent a great deal of time with the young Humphrey. Soon, the hippo responded to Marius's voice and came to him when he was called. Marius would spend the entire day with his newfound friend. They went swimming together, and Humphrey even allowed Marius to ride on his back, sometimes while trotting through the water and sometimes while grazing on land. Marius even trained Humphrey to open his mouth so that he could brush his teeth. It was quite something to see. Marius would feed sweet apples into the enormous open jaws of Africa's most dangerous animal. The hippo would expose its 20-inch-long canines, razor-sharp, strong, and powerful. Humphrey would gobble the apples up. They were used as a treat or reward when Marius was training him. This way, Humphrey would obey commands and was under strict control by Marius. He had become domesticated, or so Marius thought. As Humphrey grew, so did their bond. Marius thought of him like a son weighing up to 3,000 pounds and standing 5 feet tall. A son that was soon to betray his father. Hippos spend up to 16 hours a day in the water, keeping cool and out of the blazing sun. They can be dangerous both on land and in the water. Attacks in the water are usually territorial. Hippos won't hesitate to attack an intruder who enters their territory. There are frequent reports of boats being upturned by aggressive hippos. Hippos typically graze at night on land. They can wander up to 6 miles each night while eating. Attacks on land typically occur when the hippo feels threatened and a person comes between it and the water. Despite their aggression, hippos are social animals. The babies are often raised in nurseries with unrelated hippos, and groups or pods of adults can number in the hundreds. Locals began to make complaints about the hippo. On more than one occasion, Humphrey wandered out of his enclosure and made his way to the nearby golf course. He wreaked havoc with the golfers, chasing them around and around in delight. Marius would laugh this off, simply describing the behavior of the amphibious giant as playful and friendly. The golfers weren't pleased being chased by a 2,600-pound hippo. But when Marius whistled, Humphrey shook his head at the players and dutifully trotted back to his master. He responded only to his owner, and Marius felt confident in his ability to control one of Africa's largest mammals. But Humphrey's mischievous behavior was becoming increasingly dangerous. On another occasion, Humphrey sought out a 52-year-old man and his 7-year-old grandson. The two of them were paddling by the property in their canoe. Silently, they glided by the farm along the river Vaal when Humphrey rushed into the water. He charged towards them menacingly. Hippos can run at speeds of up to 19 miles per hour on land and push through the water at 5 miles per hour. He was no match for the pair, and they hurriedly jumped out of their boat and scrambled up the nearest tree. With Marius nowhere to be seen, the two terrified locals remained in the tree for over 2 hours, while Humphrey paced around the base of the trunk, becoming increasingly frustrated. They clapped and yelled, trying to scare him away, but Humphrey wasn't having any of it. Eventually, Marius showed up and tempted Humphrey back into his enclosure with an apple, much to the relief of the man and his grandson. Humphrey continued to escape from his enclosure, seeking out mischief when he did so. He ran through neighboring farmland, chasing livestock and killing young calves. He even threw Marius off his back when he didn't want him there. Marius's friends didn't want to go anywhere near Humphrey. He was beginning to become unruly. Although outsiders could see Humphrey was developing increasingly aggressive habits, Marius was blind. He was blinded by the love of his unique and loyal pet. He laughed off any complaints, simply describing the hippo as a lovable, gentle giant. And indeed, he probably was at one time. But as he grew towards adolescence and sexual maturity, Humphrey's urge for dominance grew. He was beginning to find his place in the world. He was beginning to realize his own brute strength and the damage he could inflict without any consequences. Hippos account for around 500 deaths in Africa every year. Some say the number is far higher. Either way, they are the world's most dangerous mammal and twice as deadly as lions. They can open up their jaws 180 degrees and clamp them shut with a bite force 10 times stronger than a human's. Marius documented his life with Humphrey, uploading videos of himself riding on the hippo's back. People loved this spectacle and millions viewed his photos and videos. Comments came flying in and Marius felt good about the attention he was receiving for this special relationship. But Marius's bond was so tight that he, foolishly, trusted Humphrey with his life. On November 12, 2011, tragedy struck. Marius walked into the large expanse of Humphrey's enclosure and onto the riverbank. As usual, Humphrey came trotting up to him. He was boisterous and enthusiastic. As he nudged Marius, he nearly knocked him over. He frequently pushed Marius when he wanted a treat, but his nudges were becoming stronger and he was becoming less patient. Marius handed him an apple, but Humphrey continued to pester him. Marius tried to walk past Humphrey to go down to the river, but the hippo stood still. The enormous animal shook its head and grunted. Marius shrugged off the behavior and tried once more to step past him. Humphrey shook his head again and opened his huge jaws, showing off his enormous canines, a display of aggression and dominance. At that moment, Marius knew something was wrong. Something was different. He knew that this wasn't the hippo he had nurtured as a baby. Humphrey had changed. Mother Nature was coursing through Humphrey's veins and pure instinct led him to attack. Marius could see the glint in Humphrey's eyes. He could see the bristles on his snout. He could smell the freshly chewed grass on the hippo's breath, and then it came. A bite so forceful that Marius could do nothing but gasp. Marius fell to the floor as two of the hippo's canines severed his skin, muscle, and bone. He felt the immense pressure on his torso and heard the crunch of his legs as they gave way. Marius tried to claw his way away, but Humphrey came for him again and again. Mercilessly, the hippo attacked his master. He attacked his caregiver. He killed his friend. Marius breathed his last breath looking into the eyes of his best friend, his unrecognizable eyes, the eyes of a killer. Marius's body rolled into the water and lay submerged until emergency crews discovered it a few hours later. Marius had been betrayed. He had truly believed that he and Humphrey had a special bond, a bond that would last a lifetime. But while you can take the hippo out of the wild, you can never take the wild out of the hippo, who in this case turned on his friend in the worst way possible, bringing him to his unfortunate final affliction.
Africa is no stranger to poachers. This problem that rages through the continent has nearly decimated the rhino populations completely, and countless other magnificent animals are in grave danger of being hunted out of existence, all just for their tusks, pelts, and to be traded under horrible and abusive conditions on the black market. But South Africa has been one of the leading fighters against these murderous crimes by fighting back against them with their own medicine. Long gone are the days when poachers were rounded up and released with only a slap on the wrist or a short prison sentence. Nowadays, illegal hunting is punishable by a sentence of time that is equal to first-degree murder, and the officers deployed to catch these hunters and trappers are given the right to kill on sight if they catch them. This is not just because the country is tired of losing its animals to this cruel and senseless practice. It's because the poachers themselves are armed to the teeth with military-grade weapons, and the officers out there looking for them are quite literally putting their lives on the line. More often than not, an altercation ends in a shootout. These officers are tough as nails. They're walking into an actual war zone when they take on the job. And once a team is assigned to one another, they become like family. They spend weeks on end in the bush, trekking and tracking, with only each other for company and under constant threat. You can't go to war without trusting the man next to you like you would a brother. Spamandla Matembu, 31, and his 3 fellow rangers were just that kind of team. They were out in November of 2023 at the Muhuzi Game Reserve, just 180 miles north of the city of Durban. Spamandla was the senior officer of the 4, since he'd been working in the park for the past 8 years. Not that the other guys were wet behind the ears at all. They'd all worked in the profession for 3 years or more. Naturally, the most senior of the lot took charge. Luckily, the other guys didn't have a problem with this arrangement at all. Spamandla had a sharp eye, good aim, excellent tracking skills, and most of all, he commanded respect. He never lost his cool in the face of danger, always remaining calm and focused. Spamandla had just gotten back from a 2-week leave of absence to make arrangements for the funeral of his youngest daughter. The loss was a devastating one for his wife and 2 sons, but none more so than Spamandla. A usually stoic man was utterly crushed by her passing. He'd long wanted a daughter, and she was the apple of his eye, the only one who could soften the strong and serious man's heart. And she was not even 2 years old when she died. After the ordeal, he was glad to be back in the open air, with the ground beneath his feet and the sounds of nature to help him grieve. And the job did not disappoint. The moment he came back to work, they received a tip-off that there was a group of poachers in the area that were targeting elephants. There was no time for chit-chat, and no need for him to hide his feelings. The more urgent the case, the better. Spamandla just wanted to keep as busy as possible. Being alone with his grief was agony. No, this distraction was exactly what he needed now. Spamandla's team flanked one side of the herd, while another stayed on the other side, hoping to cover as much ground as possible. When the evening came, they were relieved by 2 new teams, making sure that the elephants were always under the watchful eyes of the rangers, only to repeat the process the next morning. Spamandla and his team spent 2 days searching for signs that people were in the area. Hours spent in absolute silence, their firearms at the ready, and following behind the herd at a safe distance. 2 kept their eyes on the field to look out for movement amongst the bushes and trees, while Spamandla and another man searched on the ground, looking for footprints, debris, and splashes of blood from a wounded animal. On the 3rd morning, at 5 o'clock sharp, just as they clocked in for the new shift, they finally found the remnants of a campfire and human debris. At last, they had a trail to follow. The hunt was on. For half an hour, they continued following the footprints. The elephants had gone for a morning drink, and inevitably the criminals followed suit, and the team weren't far behind. The ground beneath their feet squelched as they neared the river's mucky bank. Spamandla was at the head of the team, the others just a few yards behind, their rifles raised and at the ready. The elephants had trampled a path clear to the riverbank, and at its head there was a sharp bend. Spamandla came around the corner first, his eyes looking down at the boot prints ahead of him. He didn't even notice the gray mound resting on the muddy bank that was right in front of him. The hippo male jumped in shock at the tall figure striding so confidently toward it. Never in all its life had the king of the river ever had any animal or human walk up to it so confidently. Its anger was as instant as it was deadly. It shook off its surprise and bellowed in fury. Spamandla came to a sudden halt when the deafening roar broke the silence of the bush around him, and by the time he realized just what he'd walked into, he was just 6 yards away from the beast, practically right on top of it. The hippopotamus is not called the most mean-tempered animal in all of Africa for nothing. That thing was already charging when it opened its gigantic mouth to roar in anger. There was no running now, not against an animal that can cover 15 miles an hour on land. He was just too close to even try. Spamandla did the only thing he could do. He raised his rifle and managed to pull the trigger, letting one shot loose. Unfortunately, it hit the beast in the layers of thick fat on its shoulder. The creature didn't even react to the bullet that embedded in its body. It didn't bother to bite the man in front of it, or to pause, or stop from the blast. It simply steamrolled 1.5 tons right over Spamandla like he was nothing. That one charge drove the ranger several inches into the wet river bank, breaking almost every rib, both collarbones, and shattering both his legs in several places. His organs ruptured from the pressure, flooding his body with blood. Behind them, the 3 rangers heard the roar, a scream, and a single gunshot. They immediately fell into formation, guns loaded, and headed straight for the commotion ahead. Had it been anyone else, they would have faltered at the horrific sight that they ran into. But these guys had seen their fair share of death and blood. They did not hesitate to do what they had to. The hippo wasn't just satisfied by crushing the man. It turned back, grabbed Spamandla up in its mouth, and bit down with a bite force of 2,000 psi. The rangers opened fire, reloading their heavy hunting rifles after each round. One after the other, the bullets flew, yet the beast didn't stop. It just kept chomping down, opening its mouth and biting down again, shaking its head so furiously that Spamandla turned into a wild blur of flailing limbs and blood. It was as if its fury made it immune to pain. It took less than 15 seconds and almost a dozen rounds before it suddenly stopped, keeled over, and dropped down dead. Just like that, one moment it was consumed by a vicious, roaring anger, and the next a bullet finally landed right beneath one of its ears, puncturing its brain. Spamandla's lifeless body was still trapped in its jaws. There was so much blood that it created a stream of its own that trickled into the river, turning the water crimson. Even the hippo's body was no longer gray. It was as red as everything around it, and so was Spamandla. As one radioed in for help, the other 2 forced the jaws open and removed their teammate. Somehow he was still breathing, unconscious but still alive, but that was almost worse than if he'd been dead. For no more than 2 minutes, his gargled breathing drowned out the river stream, and the team listened to the terrible sound of his blood-filled lungs drowning from the inside. With every labored breath, more blood poured from the 9 gaping wounds that riddled his body. Spamandla was long dead by the time help arrived just 10 minutes later. Leaving the hippo behind without a second glance, they loaded Spamandla into the back of a jeep. They were just taking a body back to a family that were now grieving their second loss in less than a month. Only when they loaded their brother in the back of the ambulance did they finally give in to their horror and grief, collapsing into one another, bloody, exhausted, and utterly devastated. Spamandla's family, too, were inconsolable. The past few weeks had been a seemingly never-ending nightmare. They opted not to view the body at the morgue. His remains were so broken and torn up that it would have just added to the unbearable trauma that Spamandla's wife already had to deal with. Later, when a recovery team went back to remove the hippo, they found Spamandla's rifle. Its thick metallic muzzle was bent at a 90-degree angle from one of the animal's gigantic feet stepping on it. Its firing pins were removed, and it was hung in the Rangers' barracks as a tribute to the man they admired and loved, but also as a stark reminder that armed poachers aren't the only things out there that you should fear. And the poachers, well, they never caught them. It's certain that they were out there somewhere. But with the commotion of jeeps and scores of people flocking to the area, the elephants that they were targeting fled so quickly into the deeper park that it's assumed they gave up their chase, for the time being at least. Incidents like this, combined with the ever-present danger of dying in a gunfight, contribute to the substantial respect the anti-poachers receive. Every day on the job could be their last. Around every corner they could meet their terrifying final affliction. Littered in the lakes and rivers of sub-Saharan Africa is the world's second heaviest land mammal, the hippopotamus. These enormous barrel-shaped animals are incapable of swimming, even though they spend most of their time in the water. Their powerful jaws are capable of crushing a crocodile or splitting a boat into 2. They don't take chances when it comes to defending their territory, which has led them to be the deadliest African animal. They are unpredictable in their attack, such that their victims rarely see them coming. When the COVID-19 pandemic came knocking, the usual routines of many people were broken. Lives were lost, and going to work or a simple trip to the grocery store without the risk of getting infected was almost impossible. Schools had to be closed to reduce the risk of infection, leaving many children stuck at home with nothing to do. In Uganda, Mugabe, a 16-year-old, was bored and tired of being locked in the house. He had read all the books he could get his hands on, did the chores, and helped his parents and siblings around the house. But he wanted something more fulfilling. As the businesses began to reopen, Mugabe packed his bags and bid his family goodbye. He was headed to his uncle's place in Karunda Maliga. Businesses were thriving here, and newbie business people had a better chance of scaling their businesses here. The competition was stiff, and only those resilient enough saw their business thrive. Mugabe was also going to try his luck here. He had always wanted to start a business of his own, and with schools closed indefinitely, he had more than enough time to grow his business. He had narrowed it down to selling chapati, a kind of fried dough that is loved by many in the East African region. He would also be selling fish, which he intended to catch by himself. Once the schools resume, Mugabe was going to use the proceeds of his business to buy himself school supplies and lessen the financial burden on his parents. He was a man with a plan. On the sunny Sunday of November 17, 2021, Mugabe woke up early to prepare his dough, which he was going to use later on to cook chapatis. While the dough was resting, he grabbed his paddle and went out to Lake Kijanabarola. Accompanying him was his friend, Kagwa. On their way there, being the teenage boys that they were, they played together their entire way to the lake. They plucked the straws of the grass on their path, picked up fallen sticks and fiddled with them. They also picked up pebbles, and when the path was clear, they'd challenge each other to see who could throw them the farthest. They burst into giggles as they made fun of each other. They finally arrived at the lake. It was peaceful and statue still, save for the chirping birds and rustling of the leaves. It was dead silent. As was their norm, they exchanged pleasantries with the residents before proceeding to the shore of the lake, where they helped each other into the canoe, careful not to topple over. They paddled the boat slowly through the lake as they got their nets and baits ready. They cast their net and caught a few fish, but it was still not enough, as some of the fish were far too small for his customers. Mugabe would throw the small fish back in the water, cast his net into the water again, and hope for bigger fish. Minutes later, he would be grinning in excitement after catching his preferred size of fish. Things were looking up, and in his mind, he was already calculating his profits per fish. He graded them and separated those that he was going to sell fresh from those he was going to fry. Unbeknown to them was a mother hippo in the water that was not pleased with their sudden presence in the cool, calm waters. Hippos spend the majority of their day in water, hiding from the blistering African sun, and they can hold their breath underwater for more than 5 minutes, so it's easy for them to go unnoticed. The paddle cutting through the water, the net spreading across the water's surface and submerging into the water, and the burst of excitement that the boys let out when they caught the fish were a nuisance to this particular hippo. She also had her newborn with her, and anything going too close to them was perceived as a threat. She was already worked up from the noise and couldn't take it anymore, since the waters were muddy from the soils that kept sliding to the bottom of the lake. The pair were unaware that they had drifted into hippo territory. The angry mother hippo was determined to put an end to the noise and restore peace for her and her newborn. Despite being extremely hubby creatures, hippos are able to glide through the water noiselessly. Their nose, ears, and eyes are located on top of their head, so they are able to see and breathe while underwater. She moved silently and fast until she was right beneath the canoe of the boys. Unaware of the looming danger, the boys continued to talk about everything they possibly could. Their plan was to get the fish and leave the lake so that they can have enough time to prepare the chapatis and fish that they were going to sell during the lunch hour. Little did they know that they'd never make it out of the murky waters of Lake Kijanabarola. The angry mother hippo emerged slightly from the water and opened its mouth wide, exposing its 3-inch canines. The hippo's teeth came crashing on the canoe and capsized it. The boys, who were caught by surprise, landed in the muddy water, but they were unable to swim to the shore. There was splashing of the water as their arms flailed and their legs kicked, and then there was dead silence. Not a sound in the water. It was as if time had stood still. The residents, who had heard commotion, raced to the lake, only to see the head of the hippo slowly go underwater. They waited for the boys to resurface, but they didn't. The residents of Lake Kijanabarola knew too well that this was the teenager's last day under the sun. For a long period of time, the hippos at this lake had been a nuisance to them and had claimed the lives of their fellow fishermen. They were a threat to their fishing activities, as the hippos would often interrupt them with a sudden attack, seemingly out of nowhere. To worsen matters, the hippos had caused them a significant food shortage, as they'd often invade their gardens and plantation and ravage their crops. They'd eat their vegetables right before harvest and step on the seedlings that had just sprouted from the ground. Efforts to drive them away had been deemed futile, and the villagers were at a loss. As nightfall came, Mugabe's uncle grew worried after he had not returned home. He was a disciplined boy who always kept track of time. So when he didn't show up at the house, his uncle put on his coat and went out looking for him. When he got to his stall, the chapati dough he had made earlier in the day remained untouched. On inquiring among the traders, he was informed that Mugabe had not returned from the lake. His uncle then retraced his steps he took to the lake. He talked to the residents and asked them if they had seen Mugabe that day. Sadly, Mugabe's description matched one of the boys. The residents informed him that 2 boys had drowned in the lake after a hippo attacked their canoe. A few brave fishermen had gone into the water after the authorities were notified of the incident, but they were unable to retrieve any of the bodies. It was now up to Mugabe's uncle to break the news to Mugabe's father. He called him, and as he waited for him to pick up, his mind raced with the right words to use to tell him what had happened. When Mugabe's father saw his brother's call, his heart was filled with joy. He picked up, and after they exchanged their usual pleasantries, he was expecting to talk to his son so that he could update him on the progress of his business. Unfortunately, this was never to be, as his brother informed him that his son was no more. Mugabe's father couldn't understand how that was possible, and everything else that he was told after that was reduced to murmurs as a deep sadness engulfed his heart. He was devastated that his son's effort in the business were all for nothing. The news had now spread across villages of another hippo attack, and they finally made it to Kagwa's family, who went to the lake, hoping to retrieve their son's body. On Monday morning, Kagwa's father requested for a day off and took the next bus to Karunda Malika, where he was embraced by his brother. Together with Kagwa's family, the 2 grief-stricken families sat by the shore of the lake, waiting for the bodies to be retrieved by authorities and the local fishermen. A gloomy cloud rested above them. The fishermen went into the water, careful not to agitate the hippos, and for the second day they came up empty. The families of the teenagers dragged their feet as they left for their homes. Thankfully, on Tuesday, 2 days after the attack, the bodies were retrieved from the murky lake, and their families could finally give them a proper burial. The boys both had deep puncture wounds all over their bodies, as if the hippo had chewed on their bodies without eating them. Some of the puncture wounds from the hippo's teeth were directly through the boys' vital organs, including their lungs and heart. It was clear that the boys didn't stand much of a chance. To date, hippos remain responsible for at least 500 deaths a year in Africa and are considered to be the deadliest land animal on the planet. If you ever find yourself near a hippo, get out of there fast. They are known to be extremely aggressive. Once they launch an attack, they don't give up until someone meets their terrifying final affliction.